Boom, what up, today we're going to be talking about everyone's favorite topic, which is damage, throughput, raid progression. Does it matter? Maybe it does. Maybe we've jumped the shark. Maybe this has all been a ruse, and I love damage. Well, I've been talking about this with some people in my guild, sort of thinking out loud. I'd like to come back, address sort of some of the common things people say when you talk about why damage might not matter that much. First thing that I think a lot of people bring up is low wipes. My guild wiped on Laerdar at 9%. It was pretty sad. It's pretty easy to imagine, like, wow, if I had done that one extra Mythic Plus key and got, a 470 hero track thing instead of my, shitty thing from normal raid, we wouldn't have wiped. It's like, in some sense, that's true. It's like, you're not actually wrong that doing that and squeezing out that little bit of extra damage might have made you kill on that pull. And in particular, wiping really low can be quite costly, especially on really hard bosses where getting a low pull in itself is a challenge. Like if you wipe on 1% at Tindral, like it might take you 20 pulls to even get back there. If that, it might take you 50. So there's a real asymmetry in that wipes when bosses are killable and wipes to throughput when bosses are killable cost a lot more in total progression time than they do in wipe count. Like, people talk about pull count because that's a nice metric to use for bosses and it's a reasonable proxy for progression time, but the thing you really care about is time spent in the raid. And if you wipe 500 times in the first minute of the fight and then 50 times after a 10-minute slog of a fight, like those last wipes, even though they're a smaller fraction of your wipe count, are really quite meaningful in your progression time, and it's worth cutting them out if you can. So if you wipe it at a really low percent and you take a bunch of pulls to get back, like, it's pretty sad that happened, and maybe that's a key point in the progression experience worth rectifying. Well, there's some reasons why these maybe aren't as impactful as people think. First of all, a lot of low wipes are also mechanical wipes. Like, it's not common that you play a boss perfectly and wipe to a lack of damage. Frequently what will happen is you have some people dead or you make some mistakes and you wipe to a low percentage. And here we could say, well, either having more damage or playing the boss better could have killed the boss in this case. Like in our 9,000 health wipe, we had someone dead at the end of the fight. They had been dead for like a minute. Obviously we kill the boss if they're alive. So is this wipe to mechanics or throughput? Now, I'm not going to claim that you should play every boss perfectly, and like it's unacceptable to ever have players die on a kill pull, because that's just going to happen. Like, people will die. You'll have to kill some bosses with parts of your raid dead. So we can't plan around really, really perfect gameplay. But the claim that I'll make here is that focusing more on mechanical execution not only wins you these really low wipes, where maybe if players were playing a little cleaner, had crisper movement, were handling mechanics better, would they not die early in the fight, and you wouldn't have to like do the end of the boss with DPS dead. But also focusing on your mechanics throughout the entire progression will make all of your earlier pulls faster as well. Whereas if you solely focus on throughput so that you can avoid low wipes, you won't improve any of your earlier progression where you're wiping to mechanical execution. You're only going to save the really low wipes where you're wiping to both a lack of throughput and mechanical failures, or just a lack of throughput. In a sense, like, if you spend some amount of time to get an equal, return on investment in both throughput or mechanical execution, you actually like save more across your progression from the mechanical execution, because that applies to all of your pulls and not just the ones that are potential kill pulls. Similarly, it's easy to look at a low wipe and say, like, look, we wiped here and then we had to pull the boss 20 more times and it fucking sucked. And it's like, well, yeah, but you remember that because it was memorable. Like, people talk about this 9k wipe because it was the lowest wipe that they had ever seen. And for me, I've pulled thousands of raid bosses, probably not tens of thousands like some people have, but this was the lowest wipe I have ever seen and maybe will ever see. You just don't see that many sub, 0.5% wipes or sub 1% wipes. They're rare for a reason. They're memorable for a reason. And focusing too much on the memorable events rather than the like meaningful events of like the things that take up most of your raid time is a sort of common failure mode for human attention, and we should try and avoid it. Another thing that's true is sometimes you wipe to when the boss is really low and think that your damage was the problem and ignore previous pulls that would have been kills had people played slightly better. Like when we had this really low wipe, we had 3 or 4 pulls prior that all ended sub 5%, with people dead for like minutes at a time. Now, again, you could say sub 5% is maybe even in the range of extra throughput that we could get by improving player skill, and that's not totally wrong. But I think it is a larger ask to get people to improve their throughput by 5% sort of over the span of one progression night than it is to just have people survive the fight until the end. Sort of evidenced by the fact that by the end of the night, we killed the boss with not much more throughput, but with everyone surviving. So clearly it was more easy to accomplish that than the other thing. When people are learning new bosses, like they're able to improve at the mechanical execution much faster than they're able to improve at the execution of rotation that they've been doing for maybe months or years. So let's focus on the low-hanging fruit and like the stuff that applies to all of our pulls and focus on mechanics here. Slow wipes, maybe. I don't think they're that important. I am more sympathetic to the claim on things like Tindral or Fyrakk, where like getting to low pulls is so fucking hard that you really want to make sure that you don't fumble those. I don't know. It feels like there's a lot of emotions at play here where like, also if you focus on your mechanics more earlier, you will get more low pulls. So try and do that, but sure. There's some bosses where like failing to secure low kills when they were killable with a little more throughput is quite damaging to your progress. What about healing? Well, frequently I talk about DPS, but I don't talk about HPS. Mostly that's because healing is more opaque to me. It's sort of harder to talk about the times when healing does matter because it's a binary pass-fail. I think this is actually a real argument in some sense, and is maybe an argument to give healers more gear. Another thing you could think about is that when you and Liquid do a boss, Liquid and you have the same DPS check in that like you both have to do some amount of damage before the boss enrages or you wipe. And that never changes for every guild. You just like get more gear to do it, and so you get to kill it even though you're not as good as Liquid. But the HPS check actually changes a little. Now, people get more stamina, which means some mechanics are less lethal. But also sometimes your players take more avoidable damage. So your healers have to heal like a larger numerator, and maybe their denominator is a little bit bigger because people have bigger health pools, but it's not obviously clear to me which direction those balance out. Like people in even mid-ranked Hall of Fame guilds take a lot of damage from lava waves on Rashok or flame waves on Smolderon, damage that like the Liquid and Echo healers just don't have to heal as much because those players are dodging everything. So HPS is like maybe even more valuable here than we might think naively. Another thing that has some sort of knock-on effects, and we'll maybe touch on like this sort of number 6 whole progression effects, is that having more healing throughput in the middle of progression might change the way that people play. If people are sort of consistently topped and feel safe, they are like more freed up attention-wise to focus on mechanics or like pay attention to what the boss is doing, maybe like optimize their rotation or their positioning. They're not like terrified for their life and focusing on surviving mechanics, or like focusing on solely surviving and not like doing things properly or executing cleanly. So healing has like almost a psychological benefit here. There's maybe some annoying thing where I think probably the worst players are like the more freaked out they get by being low HP. Whereas if you've played for a longer time and you're more comfortable in progression rating, like sometimes the boss is just going to have you at 10% HP for a prolonged period of time, and that's okay because there's no future scary events coming up, and like you just have to wait for the healers to top you up over time. You don't have to like instantly slam a health bot. But sometimes people freak out. They burn defensives, they get out of position. It causes lots of like knock-on cascading bad events for the raid. Healing is maybe more valuable. I think quantifying this is real hard. I'd be curious to see if anyone could come up with like a nice model for how much raid progression having more healing saves. A thing you can do which I've suggested is like you could just pull progression logs and look at times when people are low HP or die, and see if like more healing or less healing would have saved or killed them. But that's a challenging and maybe requires a little bit of Excel jitsu that a lot of people don't feel comfortable with. Well, we're there. Let's actually talk about number 5 as well, overkill deaths. I think this is the same thing as healing, where like people die, they feel sad. If they're low HP, they feel sad. They panic, they freak out. If they just had more health, they might feel safer, or they might not die in the first place. And so it's worth thinking if more gear will prevent deaths that way. To some extent, again, I think maybe this is overplayed. A lot of things kill you or overkill you by a substantial amount. Like you take a fire beam on Tindral, like that shit's going to kill you by 4 million damage. And there's no amount of extra stamina that could have saved you. Sometimes there are some narrow cases, like on Rashok, people probably had like 10 or 20k overkills on a lot of the later slams. And there maybe having a little bit more stamina really would mean the difference between like people living and being able to get topped up in a sort of intermission period where there's no incoming damage. Not the literal intermission, but like a pause in the mechanics, or between them dying and like just wiping because of that. Now, a thing you could do is you could look again at progression logs, maybe like scrape a bunch of progression logs, and every single damage event, you look at like this person's health was here, and then it went here. Did they live? They had like 100k, and they went to 10k. Did they live? No. How much would I have to change their health for them to die? Like here, if I take away 10k health, they die. Maybe they went from 100k to negative 5k. And if I give them 5k health more, they live. And the thing you could do is like record all the times that people get close to dying and how much additional health they would have needed to be given or taken away in order to like flip the outcome. And then the thing you do is you plot and you say like, if I gave on the x-axis additional health to the raid versus on the y-axis, like how many deaths do we save or prevent? And you just like plot this or something. And maybe it looks like this and you say like, if I give everyone 50% more HP, we save like 100 deaths or something. I don't know what reasonable numbers might look like here, but I think the shape of this plot is interesting. Like maybe it looks like this or something. And you say, oh my God, if we just gave everyone a little bit more HP, we would actually save a ton of deaths. And so the thing you want to do is like, actually, you want to go back in time and farm a little bit more gear because having that extra stamina would have been really valuable for that progression. But maybe it looks like this or something. Like on Tindral Sage Swift, I think the graph looks a lot more like this bottom thing where almost all of your deaths happen because you're hitting the raid with like an instant one-shot wipe mechanic, not because someone is like barely bleeding out and gets overkilled by a dot for 3,000 damage. It's like, yeah, you have more health, but you didn't soak a seed, and so everyone died, and there's nothing you could do about that. Again, so I think this is going to be pretty fight-dependent. Maybe there's interesting analysis to be done here, but this seems like a relatively second-order effect versus like the raw damage or raw healing that people are concerned about. So let's talk about 2 other things that people care about. Intermediate DPS checks. What do I mean by this? Well, let's talk about a more Tindral Sage Swift. He has 2 things that sort of count as little DPS checks mid-fight. The roots and the shield. So I've talked, I think, in previous videos about the fact that you kill bosses when everyone lives and rarely hit enraged timers. But bosses have like pseudo enraged timers in these mechanics that have a strict DPS check in order to continue progressing. It's like in the intermission, you just have to break the shield within 20 seconds or you wipe. So having more damage is maybe good here because it prevents wipes to the shield. And in particular, the shield here is like a pseudo enrage where every 2 seconds, the entire raid takes ticking damage that stacks up over time. So not only can you save the raid by breaking the shield in time, but the faster you break the shield, the less damage the raid takes, and maybe you prevent a couple of really low deaths and like see further in progress because of that. Maybe that's worth thinking about. Well, I absolutely agree that this is like a real thing that could happen. It's worth thinking about. But how valuable is it really? Well, Tindral Sage Swift has something like 950 million health. About 950 million. Shields him for 10% of his HP, and you have a 50% damage buff. Because the shield ticks damage every 2 seconds, we'll have like a tick here, and this length is 2 seconds. Now, let's assume, for the sake of argument, because I think it makes the numbers most compelling for the fans of DPS, that you are breaking the shield at the last possible window. Like, you're breaking it pretty close between the 18 and 20 second mark, and you're like sort of uniformly in the middle there. Like, you need to, you're breaking it before the shield actually expires and you wipe the raid, but not any earlier than that. And we don't know when we're going to be within this interval, so let's say it's like 1 second in. We're just like uniform in the middle here. Like, how much damage do we need to do to break this 1 second faster? Well, that is math. The math here is going to be 95 divided by 19 divided by 95 by 18. Like, this is how much damage you need to do to break the shield in 19 seconds versus in 18 seconds. Well, this quantity is just like 19 over 18. It's 1.055555 more fives. So you need to do 5% more damage in order to break the shield 1 second earlier and prevent an entire tick of damage. 5% of damage is a lot. Like, one item level is maybe 1% damage across the raid. Maybe a little more if it's going on to high value items. Like, early in the season, your item levels probably go to things like trinkets or weapons that punch above their weight, but for the most part, one item level is like 1% of damage. That's, I think, the Blizzard official formula. So you need to gain like 4 or 5 item levels to get 5% damage, because this is multiplicative. It's not additive. It's 1%, I think, multiplicatively. But you need to gain like 4 or 5 item levels or become a lot better at playing the game very quickly in order to do 5% more damage. On a weekly reset, you're not gaining 4 or 5 item levels other than maybe the first 2 or 3 resets in the tier. If you're in week 6 progressing Tindral and you want to break the shield 1 second earlier to skip a tick of the damage, you're not getting 5% damage out of thin air. Like, it's just not going to happen other than your players all becoming much better at their classes. That's the only possible way it'll happen. In particular, a lot of the damage optimizations that people talk about, things like using augment runes or using the correct food, or the thing I recently talked about, like doing all of your Mythic Plus vault slots to fill that out. These things contribute basis points of damage. They contribute percents of percent, not entire percents. The aug buff, I think, is something like 0.5% on your raid. Food buff, like picking the correct food buff out of all the secondary stat foods, is maybe worth like 0.2% on your raid. Something like that. And maybe if you're getting everything wrong, like your players have bad consumables, they don't have enchanted gear, they are not doing their vault at all or something like that, then yeah, you can find 5% damage with some relatively simple optimizations. But for the most part, you're finding like tens of percents of damage, not multiple percents of damage, from the kinds of DPS optimizations that relatively focused guilds could acquire. So I love the principle. I think it's like a good argument. The problem is that in order to evaluate the argument, we have to like empirically look at how much damage needs to be done. And it's just like a lot of fucking damage you need to do. Similarly, like on the roots, these are a little more of a continuous and not discrete thing where like breaking them any amount faster is good. But you can like kind of break them when people have more GCDs. There's like some thresholds to breaking them based on when they take damage. And if you kill these maybe like 10 milliseconds faster, I'm pretty dubious that any raiders are reacting quickly enough that like actually changes the outcome of any of their deaths. In particular, well, it's good to break these roots as quickly as possible. The thing that most affects the way these roots get broken is how tightly stacked they are for people to do damage to them, and how efficient you are at hitting them with the dragons. Obviously, on the non-dragon root sets, like they just have to be tightly stacked and people have to respond quickly. But here, I think that like if the roots are alive for, let's say, like 5 seconds, I don't know if this is actually right because I didn't look up the value, but let's use that number. Maybe they're live for longer than that. Maybe they're not. You could kill them in 4.5 seconds with like 10% more damage. And that's really hard to do. It's hard to come up with 10% damage to these roots unless you're like actively moving cooldowns onto them. In that case, we're not talking about the like typical throughput things that I care about. We're talking about like strategizing the fight and optimizing our cooldown usage, which is like relatively cheap to do, and we should all do that. But finding 10% damage from like having better gear that you farmed over time, or getting augment runes or something like that, that's just not easily possible. Even like 10% damage from better play is a tough ask in a guild that's already relatively competent. It can be done, but it's hard. But what if your raiders are like reacting to these seeds like 300 milliseconds too late? What if they're always mid-global when these seeds come out, or when the roots spawn? Roots, not the seeds. But if they're mid-global when the roots spawn, and they have to take like half a second to even use another global on the roots, you then save 10% of the time by just like having people pre-prepared for this. You found 10% damage out of nowhere without having to like have more gear, or spend more time farming, or spend more time re-clearing the raid. All these things that are pretty costly in terms of time can just be saved by like preparing for the mechanic and thinking about what you need to do in advance. So here's another case where like I agree the principle that you want to break these roots as quickly as possible totally applies, and it's good to try and do that. It's just about like where can you achieve the most bang for your buck, and like you can achieve a lot more by just having players focus them and like maybe shift some cooldowns, maybe try and react as quickly as possible, maybe hold damage for like half a second so that they have a free global as soon as the roots spawn. Those things will get you way more value than like re-clearing heroic for the 5th time to get another 3000 raid DPS. Like that second thing is a complete waste of time for breaking the roots faster, but people will re-clear heroic and do a lot of mythic plus saying like, we need this damage to break the roots. It's like, you do need damage to break the roots, but you're finding it in the wrong places. Let's try and find that in the raid and not out of the raid in, the Throne of the Tides or something. Like that's the wrong place to be looking for that damage, brother. We talked about overkill deaths, so let's talk about skipping mechanics. What do I mean by this? Well, I think this is a very similar argument to intermediate DPS checks, and sort of low wipe similarly. People argue, like, if you have more damage, you skip mechanics at the end of the fight. End of the fight is usually the hardest, so you get, like, relatively more value for skipping those mechanics, because people are already stressed, they're, like, on the verge of dying. Skipping those is quite valuable for your progression, and I agree with that. Problem is, this is, I think, another empirical question based on, like, when you are currently killing the boss and when you could feasibly kill the boss with more damage. There are certainly fights where you're killing the boss, like, 3 seconds after a scary mechanic, and if you just did, like, a little bit more damage, the boss dies instantly. But if you aren't killing them right after some mechanic comes out, you probably need to do more damage than you think in order to skip that mechanic. So if we look at Tindral again, Tindral is like a 7.5 minute fight. There's like 450 seconds. Maybe a little shorter, maybe like 440. Right around 425 seconds maybe. There's a set of roots into a set of seeds, and then you have a couple free seconds to just like kill the boss. And a lot of guilds find themselves sort of at like 5-ish% going into this boss, going into this set of mechanics. They have to play them out, and if they like succeed doing those mechanics, the boss dies. The thing you might think is like, well, if we don't extend and we re-clear heroic and we re-clear mythic and we do a bunch of mythic plus, we will have enough damage to beat that mechanic and like save a bunch of progression time. Well, clearly, like, to go from 440 to 425, something like 440 over 425 more damage that you need. And this is something like, it's approximately like 1.04. Or you need like 4% more damage. Again, this is just like intermediate DPS checks. The principle is sound, but we have to care a lot about the empirical values that matter here. In order to skip a set of mechanics like this on Tindral, where you're late to kill the boss by 15 seconds, you need to do 4% more damage. Or like, since the boss is 5% going into them, like you had to have done 5% more boss health in the preceding 7 minutes in order to kill this boss before those mechanics went out. That's just a tough ask given the amount of gear that's available in mid-tier mythic reclear, in mid-tier heroic reclear, in great vault slots from augment runes or consumables. Like, you're just not finding that damage from those places. It's tough, but you probably have to play the mechanics in these cases. Now, sometimes, like in this tier, you get a Helm enchantment, which gives you something like 2 or 3% more damage, and in that case, that might actually put you over the edge. But you have to evaluate this on a case-by-case basis, because if you blindly say, like, we're going to reclear because it saves us some mechanics on harder bosses, you're going to find yourself reclearing Mythic when you're on the end boss, and, like, you spend 3 hours of your day farming bosses that give you a couple thousand raid DPS and just incinerated a ton of progress time. I talked about this a little bit on Sarkareth, but, like, if you look at a boss and you know it's going to take 30 hours of progress to kill, which is, like, a reasonable amount for an end boss, then if you spend 3 hours reclearing the raid, you said, these 3 hours are going to save us more than 10% of that progress time. 10% of progress time is so much progress. You should just raid and, like, pull the boss instead of trying to reclear, where you're obviously not going to get 10% more damage or anything close to that. Here's the same situation. Like, there are cases where you're going to be right on this cusp of beating mechanic, and you say, like, okay, we're reclearing because if we beat this one mechanic, the boss becomes, like, 5 times easier, and we're going to kill it in 3 or 4 pulls. Awesome. Go ahead, do that. That's a great evaluation of the circumstances. We just have to be deliberate and think about everything we're doing. Finally, let's talk about whole progression effects. Now, this is maybe a shitty way to phrase this, but a thing that's true is your progression gets better the better your earlier progression is. This maybe sounds tautological, but, like, if you get to P2 of a boss with 18 people live who are all healthy and have all their defensives, you are more likely to see good progress in the boss, even though it's nowhere near killable. So things like Tindral Roots, Fyrakk adds in P2, even if you don't need more damage to not wipe the raid to them, having a little bit more damage to make these things really consistent and really clean will make your progression smoother. This is just necessarily true. And it's a good reason why maybe I've undervalued DPS. If I look at solely things like bosses or pulls where the boss was near kill range, that undervalues, like, the value. It undervalues what DPS was bringing to the raid for the, like, 400 pulls in the previous progression, where, like, having a little bit more DPS every time meant that people were a little bit healthier going into phase, or that these ads died a little bit quicker, and people were able to regroup a little bit more before the next phase started, or something like that. Again, I think these are true, and it's the same problem with low wipes, where we're sort of maybe misattributing the progression. It's true that having a little bit more DPS can make your future progression better, even if it's not directly contributing to you killing the boss right now. But the same is exactly true of mechanical execution. Like, if you're handling a mechanic sloppy on Smolderon, you will make the rest of the fight harder because your room is messier and people are in weird spots and you have balls going off at weird times. So if you just focus on doing the mechanics properly, you'd kill the boss quicker and have smoother progression. This is sort of what I've argued when I claimed that, like, you should do a lot of pulls where people don't do the rotation and just focus on mechanics. That will set you up for future progress in a major way. And if you're going to argue that this effect exists for having more throughput, you say, like, if we have a little more throughput, all of our progression will be a little bit smoother, even if we're not going to necessarily kill the boss with this extra throughput right now. Well, that's like half of the claim. The other half is you have to say, spending the time to get this extra throughput will make our progression smoother by more than it would if we had spent that time just pulling the boss or, like, focusing on the mechanics. I think reclear is, like, the canonical example here. We're like, yeah, maybe you reclear, you have a little bit more damage, a little bit more stamina, so your progression pulls go smoother. But if you just, like, spent those 3 hours of progression pulls on the boss, they would be an ugly 3 hours, but they would make the rest of your progression way smoother than the extra gear does. So it's not enough to say it's an absolute fact that having more gear will make your progression smoother. You have to say it's a relative fact that having more gear will make you stronger than had you spent the time used to acquire that gear on pulling the boss. And these relative claims are where a lot of people, like, struggle to explain the real size of the effect. A lot of the points that I've brought up here, like, people have sound theoretical arguments for why damage helps you kill bosses faster, They just haven't done the careful and I think difficult work of estimating the magnitudes of these effects. It's all true that low wipes are bad and can be saved by more DPS. It's true that killing roots on Tindral will help you kill the boss faster. It's true that you can have more damage to skip mechanics in some bosses and kill the boss faster. We just have to look at the actual numbers and see how much faster is this extra damage killing the boss. Is it realistic to get that much more damage? What if we had spent the time used to farm up that extra item level on something else, like focusing on the mechanics or preparing for a boss or something like that? And those claims are much trickier and I think much harder to defend for the people who are in favor of reclearing. Now, I'll say one final thing, which is social. Coordination problems. Incentives. What are these words? Well, these are why people like doing damage. Number one, WoW is a social game. WoW is a social game played by a lot of people who started playing WoW because they liked having cool items and having a cool character. There's not that many people who started playing WoW because they evaluated the landscape of games and said that this was the best thing that suited their competitive itch. No, they played it with their friends. They had a lot of fond memories farming gear. They like the feeling of their character doing damage. They don't like the feeling of other people doing more damage than their character. They like having lots of good items. They like having a high item level relative to other people. Things like that. And these incentives and social reasons for people to play the game are destructive to progression rating. Maybe they're globally not destructive in that people having these fun incentives and social incentives means that they continue to raid and raiding is healthier with a greater population. But in the short term, having these incentives as opposed to doing the thing that's best for the raid progression overall will hurt your progression. But it's a fact of life. People care about gear. They're going to do things that get them gear because it makes them feel good. It's fun to have gear. It's fun to do damage. It's not fun to VOD review or review logs or pull a boss when you feel like you're under geared for it, even if that's objectively the correct thing to do. So people do the things that make them feel good, which is farm gear. Farming gear is easy. It's a nice dopamine hit when you drop something because of the RNG nature of it. There's lots of sort of lizard brain reasons why people might like to farm gear as opposed to doing the thing that's best for progression. What is this other thing? Well, let me accidentally draw a cock on the screen. And we will say coordination problems. Coordination problems come up because it's hard to get a lot of people to do something. It would be great if we could organize raiding guilds to all do the same thing with all 20 players, some kind of fucking Borg hive mind where it's controlled by the guild leader and they just do the optimal thing at every step. That's not possible though. In particular, it's a lot easier to tell people, hey, outside of raid, go fill up your Mythic Plus vault. That's easy, and people will do it. It's a clear, achievable target. It happens within the game. It's very obvious how to accomplish it. No one has to think. It's just something you can do on autopilot. If you tell people, hey, don't fill up your M Plus vault, but watch a lot of VODs of your gameplay and think about how to get better. It's well, people can't do that. It's pretty hard. I talk about this as something that's useful. I don't actually do it that much. I do it way less than I should. I farm way more M Plus than I should. Even as someone who is pretty staunchly against farming gear, I'm subject to all of these incentives, and it's hard to break out of the social dynamics that govern the game. Similarly, it's pretty easy to tell people, hey, we're going to raid at these times, and then outside of that, go do Mythic Plus. It's hard to tell them, hey, the relative value of Mythic Plus changes over the course of a tier. So at the start of the tier, you should do a lot of Mythic Plus, and then by the end of the tier, you should do none, and we'll add a 4th raid night. That's objectively correct in terms of achieving better raid progress, but it's hard to coordinate human schedules when it's a video game and not their real life job. So I can complain about it a lot. It's very understandable, but it's very understandable why gear pervasive thinking dominates World of Warcraft. It's the backbone of the game. It's how a lot of people grew up enjoying the game. It's social cohesion. It's sort of the social glue for the game. Gear is everywhere. It's the background miasma of the game. It's hard to escape that, but I'm going to keep yelling about it anyway because nobody thinks about these kinds of things, and a lot of people get them just terribly wrong. And I think there are hundreds of guilds that could clear the raid weeks earlier. They could jump dozens and dozens of progress ranks by just not making fucking awful decisions with how to spend their raid time or with how to spend their sort of mental energy. Stop thinking about throughput so much. Think about doing the bosses better. You should, if your raiders greed for damage, you should kill them in real life, something like that. Let's focus on the things that matter the most.